The final verse of it goes, maybe there is a God above, but all I've ever learned from love was how to shoot somebody who outdrew ya. And it's not a cry that you hear at night. It's not somebody who's seen the light. It's a cold and it's a broken hallelujah. This is a reading from an early paper Martin Luther King wrote, and it's just a little paragraph. It expresses something of the radicalness of his theology, and also he's talking here about the experience of Easter. So he says, the last doctrine in our discussion deals with the resurrection story. This doctrine, upon which the Easter faith rests, symbolizes the ultimate Christian conviction that Christ conquered death. From a literary, historical, and philosophical point of view, this doctrine raises many questions. In fact, the external evidence for the authenticity of this doctrine is found wanting. But here again, the external evidence is not the important thing, for it in itself fails to tell us precisely the thing we most want to know. What experiences of early Christians led to the formation of the doctrine? The root of our inquiry is found in the fact that the early Christians had lived with Jesus. They had been captivated by the magnetic power of his personality. This basic experience led to the faith that he could never die. And so, in the pre-scientific thought pattern of the first century, this inward faith took outward form. Thus ends the reading. There are many different views that people hold in this world about what happened on that Easter morning over 2,000 years ago. And it's important to remember that the Gospels were written much later, decades later, and they were not written as first-hand accounts. When you think about it, you realize that the author of the Gospel of Matthew, for example, was not someone who was actually there at both Jesus' birth and his death. And nor does the author insert himself into the story as an I character at any point. It's a third-person telling of the stories, and telling of those stories that have been gathered by the writer about those occasions of Jesus' life. The earliest writer in the New Testament really is Paul, and that's where we have the first-hand account. And it's worth noting that Paul doesn't share any of the stories of the resurrection of Jesus with the empty tomb and the women going there. And the gospel writers disagree on just exactly who was there first and exactly what transpired. But Paul does assert that he had visions, and he had himself, he says, an experience of a resurrected Jesus, and he says that others he knew did as well. So what are we to make of this? What I make of it is that something profound had occurred. John Dominic Crossan again writes, what they found, even after his execution, was that the empowering kingdom was still present, was still operative, and was still there. Furthermore, however one expresses it, Jesus' presence was still experienced as empowerment, not only by those who had known him before, but by others hearing about him now for the first time. Easter faith, he continues, is no more or less a mystery than any other faith, but it did not start on Easter Sunday. It started among those first followers of Jesus in Lower Galilee long before his death, and precisely because it was faith in empowerment rather than faith in domination, it could survive and, in fact, negate the execution of Jesus himself. I don't know what happened on that Easter morning. I was not there. But I know that at the very least, there were people who believed deeply in Jesus. And these people believed in him, and these people had visions of him. That's the least possible thing that could have occurred. The oldest we have in terms of the dates of writings are Paul's examples in his letter. And as I said, Paul doesn't talk about the empty tomb or the women going to it or any of that, but he has an experience on that road to Damascus. He's heading off to round up Jesus' followers and bring them into courts or prisons, and something happens to him, something that changes his goals and changes his life, something that convinces him that Jesus was a God and did not die. He has an experience, and it changes him forever. And it may be from that experience alone that we get the other stories ultimately. Beyond that, I can't know for sure. But I do know that faith in Jesus' message did not die when he hung upon the cross. Instead, the message grew, the movement grew. It was an expression of a belief that love does not die, that justice does not die, that peace does not die. We have no equivalent to this. In the modern era, we have no equivalent to the stories of resurrection other than Elvis sightings, maybe. We have only the way in which we know that the message carries on. We have the constant repeating of the words and images of a leader, the repetition of I have a dream rippling throughout our culture. We have a movement growing after death of a leader until President Johnson finally signs the Civil Rights Act, spurred into action by the death of the leader. The dream that King uttered was not allowed to die. The early Christians had a dream that they didn't want to die too. They had a belief that the experience that they shared together, this kingdom experience, as Crossan calls it, was right, was important, and it could not be allowed to die. And so they carried it on. Our next hymn is number 199, Precious Lord, Take My Hand. This was actually Martin Luther King's favorite hymn. As he lay dying after being shot on April 4th, 1968, at that Lorraine Motel in Memphis, he spoke to Ben Branch, who was a musician who was playing at the evening event he was supposed to speak at. And Martin Luther King's last words were to Ben and said, "Ben, make sure you play Take My Hand, Precious Lord in the meeting tonight. Play it real pretty." Please stand as you're willing and able. This next video is the granddaughter of Martin Luther King, Yolanda Renee King, last weekend at the March for Our Lives. Okay. Well, the other one started automatically when I didn't want it to, so of course this one.
My name is Yolanda Renee King, granddaughter of Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King. My grandfather had a dream that his 4 little children will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream that enough is enough. And that this should be a gun-free world, period. Will you please repeat these words after me? Spread the word! Have you heard? All across the nation. We are going to be a great generation. Now I'd like you to say it like you really, really mean it. Spread the word! Have you heard? All across the nation. We are going to be a great generation. Now I'd like you to say it like you really, really mean it, and the whole entire world can hear you. Spread the word! Have you heard? All across the nation. We are going to be a great generation. Now give yourselves a hand.
I think I need new batteries in my clicker. So we don't know very much about the early Christian church, but much of what we know is from the Apostle Paul. And after Paul has his conversion experience, Paul then travels around writing to and visiting the early Christian groups that are formed around the area, forming them around the area, telling them how to behave, how to keep going, essentially how to organize as early churches and how to live out the message of Jesus. What we know is that after the death of Jesus, the movement was struggling, but other leaders emerged, and the stories continued to be told, and the religion of Christianity began to form. Paul's story is actually one of the earliest stories we have of community organizing, of a model for resistance and change, and it's a religious model for resistance and change. Jesus began that community organizing, but Paul and the apostles, they take it to the next level, establishing communities of Christians across the empire, using the technology of the day, letters on paper, to communicate across the distance and hold the growing community together. Today, we have many more tools at our disposal for sharing the good news, for working for justice, for changing the world, and for building the kingdom on earth. And I think an example of that going on right now is these students from Parkland, and it's an excellent example. They're tying it to the work of Martin Luther King Jr. with making sure that the connection between gun violence and violence against people of color is recognized by being intentionally inclusive in their modes of operation and through the direct inclusion of Martin Luther King's granddaughter. They're connecting themselves to that line of activism that goes back to the 60s. And King connected that line of activism that goes back to Jesus Christ. Like the early Christians, these Parkland students had an extreme experience and a brutal and violent one, and it changed their lives, and they emerged transformed. And like apostles, they are going out from Florida as emissaries across our land, trying to spread the message, build the movement, and transform the empire. They are not claiming to be doing this as a religious conversion experience. They are not claiming that it's a message from God. And you may not entirely agree with their message, but they are a clear example of how to build a movement quickly out of disaster. They are an example of a passionate response to violence. At Easter, we remember that the word passion comes from the Latin word for suffering, which is why we talk about passion plays and the passion of Christ. These students know passion. Today on Easter, I've tried to look through the lens of those early Christians to see what their experience means for our world today, and through the lens of social movements now to understand that experience so long ago. Ultimately, the experience of those early Christians is unknowable to us. But what we can know is what the legacy that they built means to us today. We continue to use this model that has evolved through the centuries and been handed down to today of church communities that bring people together to spread the message that was Jesus' message, a message of radical inclusion, a message of love, a message of peace, a message of nonviolence. May we continue to build the dream that he died for so long ago. Happy Easter. We began with Alleluias and went through the sadness of Hallelujahs, and we come back out to the glory of Hallelujah again with hymn number 201. Please join in singing. I will call out the verse. You'll see at the bottom it says a bunch of different verses. I'll call out the verses to you so that you'll